Organizational Security Part 2. I think I'll go ahead and just dive right into this second part of organizational security domain of the Security Plus series here. And what I'm going to do is basically just define some various terminology that relates to operational security or organizational security. Let me adjust my microphone here. This is also going to be tying into security management. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is the concept of secure disposal, which is going to also introduce some other concepts as well. Next, we'll talk about AUP, or acceptable use policies, the concept of mandatory vacations, personally identifiable information, PII, and then several do's, due care, due diligence, and due process, SLAs, and then finally, security-aware human resources. Now, CompTIA lists this domain objective as secure disposal under organizational security, but there's a whole heck of a lot more going on here than just the secure disposal of hardware and documentation and the like. Before you can even begin to have a disposal process or a disposal policy, you have to have this incredible amount of information and hardware and storage classified in your organization. You have to be able to automatically downgrade information, making it less important or less vital. You have to indicate the amount of time that information is going to be retained or reviewed, or hardware and storage is going to be retained. Maybe it's documentation that's in web-based format in Microsoft SharePoint, for example. You have to review on a regular basis whether the information has to be retained or disposed of, or disposition. The U.S. government, by the way, actually has an automatic declassification system that's basically saved them billions of dollars in storage and security costs. So before you look at disposing, you really have to have a policy in place for classifying your data and information in your systems, as well as hardware and software. So this really ties into a larger kind of policy here, security management, where we look at our information storage policy and our retention policy. We've determined how we're going to store information. We've determined how long it's going to be retained. And by the way, the retention period for your data or your hardware systems may be mandated by some other organization. Maybe you're adhering to a Department of Defense model, and it's being dictated to you or mandated to you how long you have to keep information. Maybe it's Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, and you have to keep it for a certain amount of years. So these mandates, these initiatives and policies should help you identify how long you're going to store information and what your retention policy is. Again, this is a huge issue for large organizations, just the amount of data that they have backed up and stored in off-site facilities. This can go into records management. I mentioned SharePoint. They have an entire records management software solution. Data library capabilities, operational procedures for storage, retention, and disposition. This really applies to government agencies, to universities, and the like. You may also tie into this a disposition workflow, which you're determining at the instance that you're creating the data or the document or the file, how long you're going to retain that, and you tie a workflow process in that so that after a certain period of time, somebody is notified through email or some other messaging capability, and an automatic workflow process starts as well. Your information destruction policy should include shredding, and many local companies provide shredding services. You just take all of your paperwork into them and they'll shred it for you, or they'll come by and pick it up in a truck and take it. They're licensed and bonded companies, and they shred the information. It means truly deleting the information on the hard drives of all the systems you're using. So shredding, incineration should be used. When your computer systems have reached the disposition phase or they're retired, the disk drive should be zeroed out. All magnetic media should be degaussed. G-A-U-S-S-E-D is a term you should know. This means basically applying a strong magnetic field to initialize the media. Degaussing is also known as disk wiping. So you want to zero out or wipe out those disks. You can also do a low-level format. As well, Windows systems can use the debug command to do a low-level format. So your security policy should have this information creation, information storage, retention, and disposition policy. It can be automated, but you need to have it documented and in place. Now, what about companies that decide, they're going to close their doors and they're going to resell a bunch of their systems up on eBay? Well, you have to be careful, because remember, if your computer systems have licensed software on them, or if the hard drives have sensitive information on there or privacy information, this could come back to bite you from a legal standpoint. You could be violating the EULA, the End User License Agreement, by selling a computer on eBay that has a previous operating system, or let's say a previous software suite like Microsoft Office, for example. So you may have to go over and remove all the operating systems from all of your computers to be able to sell that and be within the licensing agreement. So these are all key aspects of secure disposal and security management. Under the umbrella of policies and procedures and security management, let's talk about acceptable use policies. And this is something that's really applied to me quite a bit as somebody who's worked for several large companies as a remote worker, and I'm working with the equipment and software that the company sends me. So acceptable use policies deal with computers and information that's provided by the company or the organization. And the policy needs to lay out in very certain terms what activities are allowed and what activities are forbidden on the equipment and the systems. Now, it could be something as, general as computers provided by the company or for company business only, but you may have to include some type of monitoring or some type of proxy service, for example, for their web activity, to make sure they're adhering to the security policy. Now, you may break this AUP down into web access policies, email usage policies, and private usage policies. You'll also have information and procedures regarding telephone system usage, how you use information, and how to deal with questions for any gray areas. Sometimes this will be under the auspices of the HR department, or it may be the IT department, or some type of agreement between both. Different companies handle this differently. Typically, when you hire a new employee, they will go through a process of a checklist or maybe an online training where they'll be trained in the acceptable use policies, or they'll go through and have to sign off on a document and have that submitted to HR. Now, I've mentioned human resources a lot, and because of the need for security, a lot of the security aspects have been moved from IT, which deals with infrastructure and implementing some of the mitigation and countermeasures and controls, to more of the policy for security being handled by human resources. So you want to make sure that you've got a security-aware human resources team. They want to have solid security-based hiring policies. In other words, are they going to be doing background checks on individual users? How does that weigh into privacy issues with like HIPAA, for example? In the hiring process, are they making sure that the new hires go through a training process, an awareness process, maybe online or paper-based? Are they signing off on all the right documentation? Termination. This is simply more than just letting a person go or firing them. Okay? You have to have a clear, delineated process, and it could be different on a department-by-department basis. It could be different depending upon voluntary or involuntary terminations. When an employee leaves the company, how are you going to get that equipment back? How are you going to make sure that all the data that's stored on that equipment is removed properly? How do you know that they discontinue using certain accounts? A lot of times, if HR knows that an involuntary termination is coming, they'll actually alert the IT department first before the employee is notified, so IT can have the steps in place to maybe back up information on file servers and be ready to have badges returned. Maybe facility security has to get involved and maybe, kindly and respectfully escort the employee off the campus, but making sure that their physical access tokens and badges are confiscated. So it's a very tender process here, but it's one that needs to be laid out very well in policies and procedures. Training and awareness is extremely important. This should be done on the website, the portal, the corporate portal to the public. They should have a good idea of where they can access information so that if they're a potential employee, they've got a good amount of information. Then, again, they should go through a new hire process that's pretty vigorous. Maybe it's involving security, AUP, sexual harassment, and the list goes on and on. Then, of course, ethics policies. What kind of mission does your company adhere to? What are your ethics? There's an organization called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, CPSR, and they have a website. Let me show you. The CPSR has the 10 commandments of computer ethics, and this is something that a lot of companies will institute as a mandate, okay? Thou shalt not use a computer to harm other people, interfere with people's work, snoop around in people's files, steal, bear false witness. In other words, using a corporate computer to go up on MySpace or Facebook and slander somebody. Do not copy or use proprietary software. Don't use others' resources without authorization or compensation. Don't appropriate intellectual property or intellectual output. Think about the social consequences. And ensure consideration and respect for your fellow humans. It's a nice little 10 commandments of computer ethics. Several years ago, I did a lot of security training and privacy training for organizations that were ramping up to adhere to the HIPAA initiative, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. And it also deals a lot with the healthcare industry. And so I would go into doctors' offices and hospitals and talk to them and train them on HIPAA security. I actually had a HIPAA certification for a while. And one of the concepts that came up a lot as it related to privacy, I'm going to go ahead and jot that down, as it related to privacy was this term PII, which is personally identifiable information. And there's a lot of different standards out there that actually federal laws that have addressed this issue of making sure that personal information doesn't get into the wrong hands. There's the OPPA, the Online Privacy Protection Act of 2003. Most recently, you've got in 2005 a bunch of federal acts were passed. The Privacy Act, Identity Theft Prevention Act, Online Privacy Protection Act, Consumer Privacy Protection Act, Anti-Phishing. A lot of this stuff happened in 2005. I'm not even really sure if, it's really doing that much good for us, but I know this PII specifically from HIPAA because the whole goal here was to protect a patient's personally identifiable information, because a lot of times studies are done, clinical trials are done, papers are written, medical documentation, and you want to leave the individual person's privacy information out, okay? And personal data basically means any information that could identify the person, the subject, either directly or indirectly, in reference to a whole bunch of information, okay? Certain things like their full name, a national ID number, social security number, telephone number, address information, even their email address, and good luck there. Vehicle registration number, driver's license number, credit card numbers, digital identities, okay? And then sometimes it'll even go to protect the individual's personal traits, like their country of residence, their age, their gender, their race, their criminal record, things like that. Now, where this gets to be troublesome is if this is put in place, then it makes forensics that much more difficult, because you have malicious users and black hat hackers out there that can exploit some of these federal laws for protecting PII. So when you need to track down the identity of a criminal, okay, it gets tougher to zero in on them if their PII is unavailable. And a lot of black hat hackers are very good at masquerading themselves or spoofing other identities or other IP addresses, for example. I haven't given you very many homework assignments. I usually give a lot more homework out in my Nugget series, but here's one for you. I want you to go up and take a look at this website, cdt.org, Privacy Issues PII. It's the Center for Democracy and Technology. And go read this interesting article and subsequent articles that link to this, talking about things like LexisNexis, for example, the P-Track service, and more about personally identifiable information. Very interesting information here when you find out how much your information is being disclosed and reused. It also has legislation over here and other privacy issues on the left-hand side. Some very interesting links. Check that out. I'm looking back over at this list of concepts and topics that we're going to cover in part 2 here, and I kind of left one out, mandatory vacations. Let me talk about that one real quick before we get down here into the do's and the don'ts, we'll call it. But mandatory vacations actually kind of falls into the auspices or the category of rotation of duties. This concept where you don't want to have any one single individual responsible for a certain area or a certain system of your organization indefinitely. You eventually want to rotate some other person in. That helps you prevent fraud. It also keeps you from having a single point of failure being in one human being. If that person passes away or leaves the company, you aren't left, kind of holding the bag trying to scramble to find somebody else that understands that duty. Again, it also cuts down on fraud because there's somebody else that understands that particular job role and is periodically being shifted in to do it, so they can kind of be a watchdog due to cross-training. Well, this brings in the concept that's kind of listed as one of the mandates here, or listed as one of the requirements of this Security Plus. That's mandatory vacations. What this simply says is you're going to force your employees to take their 2-week vacation, their 3-week vacation, so that by them leaving, it forces you to create a rotation of duties. That you have to bring in another person for 2 to 3 weeks. It also means that in the weeks leading up to that vacation, that particular individual has to kind of open up their journal, for example, and kind of cross-train some other person or persons to cover for them while they're gone. And in that process of cross-training, exposing their work process, it will cut down on fraud. There's just too many examples out there of those accountants, those comptrollers, those IT people, list goes on, who just simply never take their vacations, and they're able to kind of build up this domain of fraud and secrecy and insecurity of the organization. So mandatory vacations ties into this rotation of duties. This is also security management. Let's talk about 3 other concepts while I'm here: due care, due diligence, and due process. What do these particular terms mean exactly? If you want to get technical, due care and due diligence actually are really the same term. Due diligence is also referred to as standard of care. And this is a term that has a number of different meanings behind it depending upon the discipline we're dealing with. It could be a legal obligation, but it could be just applying to voluntary investigation. Now, the term due diligence came into use as a result of the 1933 Securities Act, which introduced a due diligence defense which could be used by broker-dealers when they were accused of disclosing information to investors inadequately. Okay, in other words, they weren't really telling them what their investments were. In other words, you have a 401k through a mutual fund, but you don't really know what your money's being invested in. Okay, there needs to be due diligence there. Now, this also applies to business transactions, the financial, legal, labor, IT field, which is what we're concerned about, IT security. And due diligence and due care simply means the process of undertaking during a information technology procurement process, going out and buying, let's say, a bunch of Cisco hardware and software, going and buying a monitoring system, going out and buying a wireless security implementation. In other words, when you go to a vendor or you go to a partner, they have to do security due diligence. They have to let you know all of the risks that are known and managed. They have to expose to you the risks in their system. Are there any weaknesses in the code? Are there any known vulnerabilities? This is also done during mergers and acquisitions, where the due diligence process goes in to assess the business risk. So due care and due diligence can also tie in to our risk assessment and risk analysis process when we're either looking at other companies and their security, when we're looking at someone to become a partner, a strategic partner, or it could be done through the acquisition and procurement of hardware and software and security appliances. Now, CompTIA wants you to know what due process is, and this is really a hardcore legal concept that actually comes from the 5th and 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, so I'm kind of surprised they have this as something we need to understand, but I guess this ties into how our organizational security can be closely aligned with legal issues and due process of law. The principle that a person has the right to be notified and be heard in an orderly proceeding to protect their own rights. So if you're going to accuse an employee of a security breach, if you're going to terminate somebody and try to prosecute them in a court of law, you need to follow the concepts and the principles of due process, giving individuals the varying ability to enforce their rights against allegations and against prosecution. So making sure that when you go through the process of maybe trying to find that black hat hacker or prosecute that internal employee for the security breach or for theft, that you're making sure that you follow with your legal department due process. Another key aspect of organizational security as it relates especially to security management is that service level agreement, or SLA, that I talked about as we deal with strategic partners and vendors, potential mergers and acquisitions, or service providers, ISPs, for example. So a service level agreement is between you and a company, or between your company and another company, like a service provider or a vendor or a strategic partner, typically related to technical support, management, maintenance, security, and network availability. They're going to lay out the performance that you expect or you demand by outlining information that's basically a contractual obligation or a agreed upon deliverable. The deliverable can be something physical or it can be something logical. It could be a service. It may be security related, it may be availability related. It's going to define what is possible to deliver within the agreement of the contract, and you want to make sure that what was promised is going to be delivered. Sometimes entering into an SLA is going to put you into a dependency relationship on a vendor or a service provider. Again, if you have sensitive data passing from you to a regional branch office and it's going across the service provider's backbone, you want to make sure that you have an SLA in place that makes sure that you're going to secure that data as it passes, let's say, from your hospital headquarters to a branch radiology unit somewhere, for example. So, if you're dealing with privacy information or PII and it's moving across that backbone, you have to make sure that you have a security mandate in place as the data passes over that provider or through that provider. Now, an SLA may even exist from an interdepartment standpoint or internally in your organization. An SLA could be between the research and development department and the marketing department, or the production department and the sales department. Often this can be what service providers are offering us in terms of what is our burst speed on our frame relay, or what kind of bandwidth are we getting on our fiber network. What type of security do we demand with our virtual private network or our IPsec solution? So you have to understand the scope and the terms of your SLAs, and this relates to organizational management and security management. Now, there are two key measures that are used in SLAs, MTBF and MTTR, and you'll be expected to know these for your Security Plus exam. The mean time between failure, MTBF, measures the anticipated incidence of failure for a system or a hardware component. This measurement determines the component's anticipated lifetime. So let's say you've got a HVAC system that is cooling your data center, okay? If the MTBF is 1 year, you can anticipate that the system will last for a 1 year period. In other words, you're going to have to replace it or rebuild it once a year. If the system or service lasts longer than the MBTF, well, that's just a bonus. Obviously, 1 year is not a very long life expectancy, but this can be applied to a wide variety of different aspects. MTTR is the mean time to repair. This is a measurement of how long it takes to repair a system or a component or a service once a failure occurs. And again, this relates to the SLA because it's typically the vendor or the partner that's responsible for repairing the system or the hardware component or bringing your network connection back online. Now, MTTR can be 24 hours, it could be 12 hours, it could be 4 hours, and it's a common measure of maintainability and availability. But you have to be careful here when you evaluate it because it doesn't typically include the time that you need to actually acquire the component and have it shipped to your location. So you want to kind of keep that in mind as well. Most SLAs are going to include things like MTBF and MTTR, and all of the things that kind of outlined based on contractual obligations and deliverables, both physical and service deliverables. SLAs, service level agreements, a big part of organizational security. Alrighty, in Organizational Security Part 2, we covered a wide variety of concepts and terminologies that relate to organizational security and security management. We talked about secure disposal, and that falls into the area of disposition of hardware, disposition of files and data. Looked at the acceptable use policy, talked about mandatory vacations and how it relates to rotation of duties, PII, personally identifiable information, which may be a mandate of HIPAA, for example. Talked about 3 do's: due care, due diligence, due process. Also pointed you to a code of ethics for computers up there on the internet, as well as some other references as well. Showed you the importance of security-aware HR and how that's going to apply to a lot of these other areas over here. And then finally, we defined a service level agreement and its importance in organizational security. I hope this CBT nugget has been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in the final nugget of this Security Plus series, Organizational Security Part 3.